So, American Bible and car salesman Donald Trump has decided to slap tariffs on steel and aluminium imported into the United States, which has in turn led to large swathes of the Australian media losing their minds. Predictably, Peter Dutton and his friends have also seen this as an opportunity to sink the boot into the PM and enter into a game of make-believe where Trump slapping tariffs on all steel and aluminium imported into the United States, regardless of the country of origin, is somehow the Australian Prime Minister's fault.
Sad reality is because of the Prime Minister's inability to deal with this issue, Australian jobs are at risk and Australian industry is at risk. And the Prime Minister needed to get this right and he didn't. This is a bad day for Australia. A bad day because of the decision that our ally in America has made, but even worse because the Prime Minister is on his knees.
So whether or not he's deluded enough to genuinely believe it himself or he's just trying to fool the electorate, Dutton is trying real hard to convince the public that he'd be able to do a deal.
If there's a change of government, that we will do a deal with the Trump administration. There's no question about that. We've got a lot to offer, not just in the defence materiel space, but obviously in financial services. Obviously, we have a trade surplus for a reason because we're a desirable destination for investment from the United States. So yes, absolutely, I believe that we can get a deal done with the Trump administration.
Yeah, okay. I'm not even sure that the Sky News crowd would be buying that one. So with all the noise and
hyperbole,
let's take a breath and establish some baseline facts. First, tariffs. What is a tariff?
Tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
A tariff is essentially a tax that's imposed by a government on goods that are imported to its country. It is the companies that import the goods into the country that pay the tariffs, with the costs, more often than not, passed on to the consumers. Here's a super simplified example to give you an idea of how it works. So I'm an Australian farmer and I sell pickles to a company in the United States. They then use my pickles in their hamburgers. Donald Trump has a bad pickle experience and decides that he'll be whacking 25% tariffs on all pickles imported into the United States. Now the US company I'm selling my pickles to, they'll have to pay a tariff on the pickles they buy off me. The tariff is a tax on the imports, remember. So when my pickles arrive in the United States, the company that has imported them would need to pay an extra 25% of the import value as the tariff. At a high level, the cost of those pickles have just increased by 25%. This 25%, it's not worn by me, the pickle exporter, it's not worn by Australia. The cost is worn by the company in the US importing the pickles. At this point, the US company that's importing the pickles can do a few different things. They can either absorb the cost themselves, pass that cost increase onto their consumers, or find a supplier within the US that can provide them pickles at a lower cost. Now, what if the US can't produce enough pickles domestically to service their own demand? Well, they'll either have to scale up domestic production or continue to import them at a higher cost. See, that's probably an oversimplified example, but it should be enough to get the point. But don't worry, if you weren't sure how tariffs worked before today, there's really no need to feel embarrassed because the White House have made clear they're not exactly sure how they work either.
When President Trump last addressed the BRT when he was on the campaign trail, his big push was on tax cuts. He's going there today as he's proposing tax hikes in the form of tariffs. And I'm curious for why he's prioritizing that over the tax cuts.
He's actually not implementing tax hikes. Tariffs are a tax hike on foreign countries that, again, have been ripping us off. Tariffs are a tax cut for the American people, and the president is a staunch advocate of tax cuts. As you know, he campaigned on no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security benefits. He is committed to all three of those things, and he expects Congress to pass them later this year.
I'm sorry, have you ever paid a tariff? Because I have.
They
don't get charged on foreign companies, they get charged on the importers.
And ultimately, when we have fair and balanced trade, which the American people have not seen in decades, as I said at the beginning, revenues will stay here, wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. And I think it's insulting that you are trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made. I'm now regret giving a question to the Associated Press.
Now enough of the pickles, because this is where things get a little interesting. Let's look Look at aluminium. Roughly half the aluminium the US use is imported. Unless the US can quickly spin up domestic aluminium production, they're going to continue to rely on aluminium imports to satisfy their demand. In which case, these tariffs are going to start to hurt the US pretty quick, at least until they're able to ramp up domestic production to meet demand, if that's even possible. As a side note, a majority of the aluminium imported to the US comes from Canada. So suddenly Trump's wet dream of a hostile takeover of Canada makes a little bit more sense now, doesn't it? The other thing to remember, so long as the US don't have enough steel and aluminium to satisfy their own demand, they'll continue to be relying on imports. And so long as the 25% tariffs are applied on all imports and no countries are provided exemptions, the playing field for countries exporting steel and aluminium is still relatively level. Now, if the Donald were to start handing out tariff exemptions to his mates, then that's when things can get a lot messier. For example, if US companies had the option of buying steel from Australia and paying a 25% tariff versus buying steel from Russia and paying a 0% tariff, then you'd expect Australian sales of steel to the US would take a hit at that point. But the Trump administration have been very clear that the tariff exemptions they allowed in Trump's first term were a mistake, and that's a mistake that they do not want to repeat this time around.
The lesson from the first Trump tariffs is that exemptions to anybody are counterproductive. They don't work for the American people.
At this stage, you can say whatever you like about the decision, but at least the tariffs have been applied to everyone, regardless of whether or not a country's leader has travelled to the US capital to bend the knee or not.
You regret not going over. The French and British counterparts both went over and met face to face.
No country has been exempted, not France, not the United Kingdom.
Something the Australian opposition are really struggling to comprehend.
Look, this is a Team Australia moment. This is a Team Australia moment. But where was the captain of the team? He wasn't there. He didn't actually go to the US. All of our AUKUS and Quad leaders personally made the trip to DC to furiously advocate for their country's interests.
Did they get an exemption?
We didn't even have the captain on the field.
Did they get an exemption, Susan?
We didn't even have the captain on the field. Well, we know the answer to that, Andrew.
The answer that Susan, with a bonus S, is looking for there is no. Whether a leader travelled to the US or not, the result's been the same. I'd hazard a guess that had Albanese flown over to the US, the opposition would have attacked him for leaving the country during a natural disaster, or fired up the old Airbus elbow attacks, and just had even more ammo to blast off, given that he'd have flown over there for the same result. Malcolm Turnbull was right on this, I think.
The government is rinsing and repeating the arguments I used successfully in 2018. And they're good arguments, but I think the situation has changed. I think the American, Trump in particular, regrets giving us an exemption because then he had to give somebody else an exemption and somebody else, and before too long, too many countries had an exemption. So I've said from the outset, I think that it is more likely that they will say it's on everybody, nothing personal, but it's on everybody. And you know, there has been an attempt to set Albanese up to fail on something that he was most unlikely to succeed in. And I'm just, I haven't got any, skin in this game. I'm just being frank and honest about the realities.
Here's another fact that's been lost in all the tariff noise in Australian media. Steel and aluminium exports to the US account for just 0.2% of Australia's total exports. As of right now, I don't think there's a hell of a lot for Australia to gain by whacking on tit-for-tat tariffs. The government is better served, I think, keeping their powder dry and seeing how things play out from here.
Australian steel and aluminium exports to the United States represent less than 0.2% of the total value of our exports. Neither is in the top 10 of what Australia sells to the United States. Tariffs and escalating trade tensions are a form of economic self-harm and a recipe for slower growth and higher inflation. They are paid by the consumers. This is why Australia will not be imposing reciprocal tariffs on the United States. Such a course of action would only push up prices for Australian consumers and increase inflation.
It might feel good to retaliate, but for now, reciprocal tariffs would likely hurt Australia more than the United States of Trump. If Trump expands the tariffs to cover off some of Australia's larger exports to the US, and the tariffs then will have a material impact on the Australian economy, then yeah, nothing should be off the table at that point. Go to town on the reciprocal tariffs. Maybe hit them where it appears to hurt most and whack some tariffs on the de facto president's car company. Here's another interesting side note. Apparently there's almost 200 kilograms of aluminium in each Tesla. Whatever the government does, I just hope they don't get caught up in the chaos. Just don't be giving away our natural resources for mates' rates or anything stupid like that. What we know about the Trump administration is that the MAGA lord's mind changes like the wind. By the time I hit publish on this video, who knows, maybe he'll have moved on from tariffs to something else altogether. Maybe he'll have kicked off a full-on invasion of Greenland, who knows. Maybe someone will point out to him the fact that the US has been running a trade surplus with Australia for years and he'll just change his mind. If you've just tuned into the news over the past week and you've been listening to Peter Dutton jabbering on about Australia's special relationship with the US, you might be forgiven for thinking the trade relationship with the US is our biggest and most critical. It's not. So here's another fact. The reality is Australian exports to China dwarf our exports to the US. Dutton has enjoyed making a big deal about Albo's supposed inability to pick up the phone to the Donald.
The Prime Minister can't even get a call, let alone arrange a meeting with the President. And it just shows that the Prime Minister doesn't have the gravitas or the ability to deal with the big issues.
Which is all a little ironic given Dutton's previous performance, as Laura Tingle pointed out.
If anyone should know about the difficulties of getting foreign leaders on the phone, it's the leader of the Federal Coalition. When last in government, the Coalition was unable to get anyone in the Chinese government to speak to Coalition ministers for several years about all the trade restrictions imposed on Australian products on its watch.
If we're playing a game of who dealt with global trade better, Labor or the Coalition, Dutton really might want to sit this one out. The Coalition's inability to pick up the phone and deal with China cost Australia billions and billions of dollars over the course of several years. As this report from the University of Adelaide found, in 2022 alone it cost the country $31 billion, which was more than the total value of Australian exports to the US that same year. To Labor's credit, and I know I'm accused of not giving them enough credit, so please lap this up. To their credit, they've unwound a lot of the trade restrictions with China that were in place thanks largely to the Coalition's incompetence. So yeah, Dutton is really not the guy to be talking about anyone's inability to get a trading partner on the phone. This whole thing should serve as a wake-up call. It's time for all this special relationship talk to get in the bin.
We have an incredible relationship, long-standing, with the United States.
The US under Trump has quickly become an unreliable partner. Historical alliances appear to account for very little. You could view this as a blessing in disguise because at least now, it should be abundantly clear to everyone in politics and wider Australia where we stand with the US.
These are matters that we have to talk about. We cannot continue this bipartisan gaslighting that is going on at the moment, where there are these massive changes in Washington affecting us and the whole world. I mean, look at the extraordinary treatment of Canada. Efforts to basically cripple Canada's economy in order to bully them into becoming the 51st state. I mean, this is all unprecedented. But yet, if you look to our political leaders, there's nothing wrong with AUKUS, everything's fine, the relationship is fine, nothing's changed.
Let me come back to AUKUS.
Well, it has changed.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.